So, as you would probably expect, I am a huge history podcast junkie. There are several that I listen to that I learn a lot from, and in the past year, there is one that I discovered that has quickly risen to be one of my favorites. That podcast is History Impossible, which is put on by a guy named Alexander von Sternberg. This podcast, if you haven't listened to it, I highly recommend it. It dives into some areas of history that I probably would have never been exposed to otherwise, and really has an interesting take. He approaches history from just some different angles that will really make you think. Had an opportunity to sit down and talk with Alexander. We had an amazing conversation, talked about all kinds of interesting things, and I learned a lot, and hope that you do too. I guess the first exposure that I had to your podcast was your interview with Daniele Bolelli.
Oh yeah,
I think
Mr. Bolelli.
I was scrolling through my iTunes or the podcast feed and saw that, and I was like, oh, it was an interview with Bolelli, with some guy who has a name that sounds like a Bond villain.
Well, and now you know me on Facebook, so now you know my full name, and it's even more Bond villain-like.
Yeah.
It's like the most German-sounding name imaginable, but the funny thing is I did do Ancestry.com. I'm a quarter German Jewish, that's it. I'm mostly just British and Irish.
Oh, man. But yeah, after that, I was like, oh, this sounds pretty interesting. And I think the first episode that I listened to was The White Death.
Oh, that's a fun one.
And after I got through that one, I was like, all right, I found a kindred spirit here. You have kind of an interesting take as far as your take on history and your podcast and everything like that. Kind of interested in your creative process. Like what goes into making a podcast for you?
Well, honestly, like what I try to do is I let my bias inform what I want to talk about. Because my bias is, frankly, I'm sure you've picked up on this, is contrarianism. I just tend to be like, look, you think this is right, but it's not right. Okay, here's the reality. So I let that dictate the topic, but then I let the topic take me away then, and then I'll draw my conclusions from that. Like, of course, I have my opinions and biases, but they all come from the information that I take in. So it's basically just looking for stories that either people don't know about, which I think in the case of Simo Häyhä, there was nothing really contrarian about that. It was more just this random Finnish guy is the greatest shooter of all time. And it's a war that the Winter War, you could say, was its own war, but it was part of World War II.
Right.
It was, in that same ballpark. And it's a part of the war that I don't think a lot of people know about.
Right.
And that's just sort of what inspired that. Honestly, like, it's really just, I find a topic based on my bias, and then I just start looking for the books and if there's a good amount of books, I just start reading. And then as I'm reading, just the sort of narrative just starts to form in my head as I'm reading. And then I sort of approach it from the perspective of a storyteller. I've given myself permission to do that because of, Dan Carlin essentially said that in an interview once. And I was like, oh, okay, that means I don't have to be an expert. This is good. Cause I come from fiction. That's where I spent the first 20 years of my life writing fiction. So it's just narrative based for me.
Okay.
So that's sort of like how I approach it, is just, can I create a narrative out of this?
Okay. You seem to have, like I said, a really unique take. I don't know if I had to come up with an analogy. A lot of the history podcasts that I listen to, and if you don't like this band that I'm getting ready to mention, it's not an insult. This is a compliment. A bunch of the history podcasts that I listen to is like listening to, Metallica,
sure,
or Pearl Jam, or Black Sabbath. Whenever I start listening to History Impossible, it's like plugging in a Tool album.
No, I do take that as a compliment. I actually, funny enough, I don't know anything about Tool.
Okay.
But I'm not against them. And I've also talked to friends who are into them. Mm-hmm. As I'm sure you know, when you're into Tool, you have a lot to say about their music, right? It's very complex, apparently. I'm thinking I should probably start listening to it now that I'm getting compared to them. So I'll take that as a compliment.
Yeah. And yeah, what I mean by that is there are layers that you go into that are just different, that seem to kind of dive into like psychology and human nature and things like that.
Psychology is what I majored in. So
Oh, okay.
I kind of have to, I lean into that just because it's sort of what I find the most interesting about. Well, I shouldn't say interesting about history, because at the end of the day, we really can't get into the thoughts too much of historical figures unless they left huge amounts of diaries and letters. And even then, but I think if you read enough about what these people said and did, you can start to see the patterns that indicate what their motivations might have been. I mean, I hope I've never said this is exactly what people in this situation were thinking. I always try to frame it as, if you look at this, and this, like lined up, it suggests very strongly that that's what they were, probably thinking when they made those decisions.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So you majored in psychology?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I did.
Okay.
Very close to double majoring in history, though, but then that would have kept me in school for 6 years. So I just didn't do it.
Okay. That makes your podcast make a lot more sense to me now, knowing that.
Okay.
That's interesting.
Okay, good. Because I think I have only mentioned it once, maybe twice. I think once was when I was interviewing Daniele about history. I might have mentioned offhand that I majored in psychology, but yes, that's definitely my wheelhouse, I should say.
Okay. I mean, to me, where that really comes out is I think you called it your World War II trilogy.
I did, yeah.
Had the themes of the first episode was trauma, and then vengeance, and then forgiveness.
Yeah.
That was a deep set of podcasts.
Thank you. I mean, honestly, I had a lot of fun with the last one I just did. See if I can get it right. Blood, Bardos, Bullets, and Buddhism. But I mean, 5 hours long. I gotta say I had fun with it. Otherwise, I don't know what I'm doing with myself. But I had fun with that. I'm having fun with the one I'm researching now. And actually, I'm doing sort of another trilogy right now. And it's basically West meets East. Westerners getting inserted into Eastern culture. The last one was kind of all about people in Central Asia. This next one is an American mercenary in China. And the one after that's going to be a British man who became a samurai in the 1600s. So it's a lot of fun. But the World War II trilogy, I don't know. I worry that might have been the best I've got in me. You know what I mean?
Oh, no. I thought it was outstanding, and I thought this last one was really good too.
Thank you.
Because you kind of dive into some stuff that most people are not even going to have any familiarity with. It's like a chunk of history that's a little bit unknown.
Yeah. Well, the Russian Revolution and Civil War, just that period of time, the 19-teens, 1920s, just, it's so crazy. Like, I talked about a lot. I left out, I don't even know how much I left out. It's insane how much information there is out there on that time period from different perspectives. It's monumentally complicated. And I was thankfully able to find a good book that really got into into the complexities, but really only from the angle of these spiritual seekers trying to find meaning in places that they used to call outside of places they used to call home, because what they used to call home was destroyed. So they turned to Mongolia, Tibet, all these places that they really only had a passing knowledge of. They didn't really know anything about these cultures. They knew superficially about these cultures. And I'm not saying I know about these cultures. I definitely don't. But I'm not going on some pilgrimage to find a mythical, non-existent kingdom in the Himalayas. So
yeah.
Yeah. But in terms of the World War II trilogy, I think that was actually where you and I started talking, because you had listened to The American Executioners, one about the Dachau reprisal killings.
Yes.
And let me actually turn this, since this is sort of a joint interview. I do, to let my listeners know, I will let them know in an intro, I'm sure. But you your channel on YouTube is seriously one of my favorite. It's one of my top 3 go-to history channels. It's
thanks.
your channel, that amazing Great War channel, that they're long done with the Great War thing. But yeah, you've seen it. It's that's great. Have you checked out their second World War channel yet?
Yes. Yeah.
I have not. I
haven't watched all of them, but
Sure.
I've caught them here and there. Yeah, they do some really good stuff. Really comprehensive.
Yeah, it's like it's you guys and Flashpoint History. You're the top 3 I like to look at because you guys do a lot of really good stuff, and I like that you do travel logs. And again, I mentioned this earlier. You've gotten me mad at myself because I didn't realize there was a German U-boat in my backyard when I lived in Chicago at the Museum of Science and Industry. So, next time I'm there, I'm going to go. I'm kicking myself right now. But anyway, I do remember you mentioning though that you're a teacher, which that can open up a whole other conversation about what this virus is doing to all of us and our professions and whatnot. But you said that you talked about the Dachau reprisal killings with your students, or were thinking you were going to, if you could get around to it. Did that end up happening? I'm just curious.
The pandemic killed all of that.
Oh, okay. So I think I remembered you saying if you got to it by the end of the school year, right?
Yeah, we had just started World War II.
Oh man!
Whenever all of this happened. But I'd been to Dachau before.
Really?
I took a group of students there. It's been 4 years ago.
Wow. Okay. That's a great field trip.
Yeah, it was good. We went to Munich and Salzburg, Austria, and a bunch of stuff like that. But anyway, Dachau was included in that. And whenever I listened to that podcast, I was like, darn, I wish that I would have known this before I went.
Did you ever see that movie? I did play a clip from it, Shutter Island with Leonardo DiCaprio.
No, I've never seen it.
It's actually a really good movie just on its own, but the scene, I remember vividly seeing that scene in theaters, and I didn't even know it was a real event, but I just remember just the weight of that story hitting me in the chest and just like making me think, I don't know what to think of this, because of course they would do what they did, because I understand they just saw the worst thing, the worst aspects of humanity. Like, how else are you going to react? But why do I feel like what they did was evil or wrong? Maybe not evil, but wrong in some way. That contradiction is really what blew my mind about that. And then sure enough, when I looked it up, I found out it actually happened. And I think we're in one of the same history groups on Facebook. I think it's World War II military history, that group.
Okay. Yeah.
And I don't know if you've noticed this. They post that story about the Dachau reprisal killings a lot in that group. It comes up at least. It comes up like once every few months, if not once a month. It's remarkable how often it comes. I mean, it's great because it gives me an excuse to just drop a link to my podcast. but it's just really interesting that story really captures the imagination of at least history and military history buffs, because I think it does raise a lot of questions about things like discipline and taking control of a situation when something crazy is going on.
Well, it also kind of dives into the fact that history is not like a clean, cut and dried story.
Yeah,
it's made up of people, and people are complex.
They are.
So there's a book that I read from whenever we're talking about the Holocaust and the Nazis and everything like that, and it's called Ordinary Men. And
I love that book. Yeah.
Okay. It's okay. You're familiar with it. Yeah. It's about.
I read it in a history of the Holocaust class in college. It was one of the best books I've ever read.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll ask my students, if you would have been there and somebody tells you, hey, here's a gun, you need to take this group out and you need to shoot them and dump them in a pit, what would you do? And everybody says, oh, I would refuse to do it. And my answer is always, no, you wouldn't.
You don't know. That's the right answer.
Yeah, you don't know. The vast majority probably would, and you don't know if you would or not.
It's that was a really painful realization for me to have when I read that book in college. I mean, when you're in high school especially, but when you're in college too, you still think you have this moral compass in your head, and you're just like, I would absolutely do this. I would absolutely not do that. And hopefully as you get older, you realize that that's just not true. You don't know what you would or wouldn't do until you're faced with that decision as soon as it's in front of you. And reading that book was actually what changed my view on that. And, you know, honestly, I think reading that book was one of the contributing factors that made me such an insufferable contrarian as it is. So, cause like I, if anyone watching or listening to this has not read that book, but wants to probably be challenged to their core, needs to read it. It's a must read.
Yeah, I guess I probably should kind of summarize it a little bit or give a synopsis. It's basically the book is basically about these, as the title says, ordinary men. These guys were police officers, bakers, postal workers that were in this reserve police battalion and got called up during World War II and were basically put in charge of clearing out these villages in Poland, I believe, wasn't it?
I believe so. It was. Were they were at the rear of Operation Barbarossa, right?
Yeah, they were like cleaning up, following the main forces.
Yeah, and they were under the directives of the SS, if memory serves. The SS was the spearhead of the final solution following Operation Barbarossa, and these police battalions were basically doing the dirty work, if you will. Right. Yeah. And quick question: when you say reserve police battalion, I'm trying to like get a handle on this again. Is that basically the same thing as the Army Reserves in the United States?
Yeah, that's kind of my understanding of it. Whenever I read the book, it was almost like a National Guard.
Imagine that. Imagine the National Guard of the United States being asked to do things like that. I can't even wrap my head around that.
Yeah.
I mean, like, let alone a regular Army force doing that. But yeah. So but anyway, if there's any other, you want to give more context, I'm sorry.
No. That was about it. I mean, that's stuff like with what I do that I'm not really able to dive too deep into, that chunk of history. But to me, that's what's most fascinating. I just did a video not too long ago where I went to a German cemetery.
I watched that just yesterday, actually. Yeah.
The responses that I got back from that were pretty interesting.
In the comment section?
Yeah, in the comment section and stuff that people just sent to me.
Okay. I was going to say, don't read the comment section. It's YouTube. Well, I actually did look at the comment section because I had a feeling. I was like, oh no, because there's going to be someone who says, oh, why are you honoring Nazis? And I'm just like, he's not honoring Nazis. He's honoring dead soldiers. And he's not even honoring. He's just showing us whatever. But I'm curious, what were the responses? Like, what were the most, like, how did it end up shaking out?
It ranged between the YouTube comments and comments that I got elsewhere. It ranged all the way from the fact that I was honoring Nazis and that it was just a giant dump, all the way to the basic theme or message that I was trying to convey was be careful how you live.
Yeah.
And I got a lot of responses of people saying, if you would have been there, you would have done the exact same thing. They weren't responsible for that, And I was like, well,
I don't fully disagree.
Yeah, I probably would have. I probably would have done the exact same thing that they did.
I mean, it's less extreme, but I would always just say, like, you don't really have to look like at Germany to see examples of Americans doing horrible things, like the internment of the Japanese during World War II. It's like, you would be a camp guard. I mean, you're an American. That's less of a leap, Yeah. I mean, go back even further with, horrible massacres like the one at Wounded Knee. Like, you can't say you wouldn't be involved in something like that given what they didn't know. I mean,
exactly.
It's just, that's that's good though at the same time. And I think that it's good that people do talk about this stuff. I don't like how shallowly a lot of the time it gets discussed.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, and I did say this at the end of my own podcast about Dachau, was I think if we can get people talking about it, then the mission that the Holocaust survivors and scholars have of never forgetting is fulfilled. As long as people are talking about it, even if it's not, as long as there's people talking about it, but they also have sources who will set them straight if they get something wrong, or if they decide to go down a really dark path of trying to claim things didn't happen.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah, it's, but yeah, that, and you said you're current. So just to clarify, you say you've been working on these videos that you took when you were in Europe. This was during you were doing a class field trip, right? Again, and then it got cut short by COVID.
So whenever I was over in Europe doing all of those videos, it was for a training for a trip that I was getting ready to take.
Okay.
So the training was in Paris. I was getting ready to take a group of 47 over to Italy.
Okay.
And then Italy took a dive quick.
Yes. Oh man.
And then the rest of the world, right behind it.
Yeah.
But whenever I was in France, that's whenever things were getting really bad in China.
Yeah. We actually ended up getting a bit of a heads up in my house because Molly, my partner, she's Chinese, so her mom, who lives here also in LA, talks to people back in China all the time. So we were finding out that there's going to be a toilet paper shortage and mask shortage like back in January. We were knowing this was going to happen. Funny thing is, Molly and I didn't take it seriously, but thankfully her mom did and stocked up because she knew what was going to happen.
Wow.
So yeah, I actually haven't really been following what's been going on in China, but the impression I have is that we really can't trust a lot of the information coming out of it at this point. So I don't know.
It seems to be pretty sketchy at best.
Yeah.
But,
yeah.
So I don't know, it kind of brings up another point. How are history people looking at this pandemic, do you think?
History people, I think there has been there's been an uptick in videos and podcasts about the Black Plague and the Spanish flu. And that's great. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But putting on the psychology hat again, I almost considered, I was already really delayed on this, 5-hour podcast I just dropped. So I didn't, but I really considered saying, hey, maybe we should do a podcast about moral panics. Not that a pandemic isn't something to be worried about. I just think that the bigger consequences of this pandemic are going to be psychological in the long run.
Yeah.
Like we're already seeing it. Social media has never been a measured, rational place, really.
No.
But there's a lot of people who are online a lot more often than they used to be. So that level of irrationality and immeasuredness, I don't know if that's a word, but you know what I mean? Just like that level has increased, I think. And I think it could start spilling into everyday life, especially, I don't know. I was posting about this or talking to a friend about this rather. It's disturbing to me on both ends, like how in my home state in Minnesota, there's a bunch of protesters gathering around outside of the governor's mansion. And I'm seeing a lot of people getting mad at them. And I get it. If you are all about risk mitigation, you don't want crowds of people that aren't necessarily vital. I get it when you are okay with going to the grocery store and not being okay with gathering in protest or going to parks. However, the level of vitriol and anger I'm seeing at people who are protesting, which, like it or not, is their right to do. It's their right to do it. They should be allowed to, and we should be allowed to say, yo, don't do that. That's not a good idea. But I am seeing the majority of responses I'm seeing, this could just be the Facebook algorithm, who knows, are people literally actively wishing harm on these people. And that just says to me that what this is about is people saying, your feelings aren't as important. Your feelings are not as important as my feelings on this thing. And therefore you should just stop existing. And that is really what concerns me more than anything else. It's something we've seen before, but I don't like that we're seeing it during a health crisis, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely kind of bringing out some ugliness.
Yeah.
For sure. Whenever all of this started, oddly enough, I was reading a book called Pale Horse. It's either Pale Horse or Pale Rider, but it's about the 1919 flu pandemic.
You're kidding. That's good. That's such a weird coincidence.
So I'm reading this as all of this stuff is unfolding.
Yeah.
It was strange because in some cases you could just change the dates and it would be like you were reading something online.
Yeah. There was a video going around that was kind of unsettling. Just out of context. Sorry, I have a cat meowing at me. If you're picking that up. There's a very chilling video that you've probably seen, maybe even remember, from 2005, 2006 of George W. Bush literally making a speech saying, every 100 years we get one of these.
Yeah.
And we need to be better prepared for this. And maybe that, I don't know the details of what happened afterward. I'm sure there's plenty of people who are willing to step up and say, actually, he didn't do enough. And I'm like, okay, fine, he didn't do enough. I'm just saying that the video is insane. It's just the prescience of it is insane. And yeah, I would not be surprised if we see a lot of parallels by 2021 to things that happened during the Spanish flu. It was, I've seen also, though, what's funny is from you asked how it's been. I don't remember how you phrased it, but you said something like, how is
are
it,
history guys?
Yes, how are history guys looking at it? I think it's interesting because and you might have seen this too, when it was starting out, we were seeing these people saying, hey, here's some parallels. Here's a parade that happened in, I think it was Philadelphia or something.
Yes.
And it went, and then they all got sick and the outbreak got worse because of that. And that was just sort of an interesting historical parallel. But now people who aren't really into history are using that article and weaponizing it to shame people, which just baffles me that that's not what history is for. We're supposed to learn from it.
Well, and that's something that's kind of unfortunate is the, people taking history and weaponizing it instead of learning from it. So this is where you get people who say, that Donald Trump is literally Hitler. You look at that,
whenever I see people like that, I drop my first podcast episode. I'm like, he wasn't Hitler. He was this crazy Irishman in the 1870s.
Yeah, exactly. Which, by the way, that was another fine piece of work.
Thank you.
Kind of looking at some of the parallels there, because but so where I live, I'm in the Midwest.
Yeah.
I am in Trump country.
Sure. Yeah.
So my county went 80% for Donald Trump in the last
80%. Wow.
80%. Okay. Now,
yeah.
During the last presidential cycle, here's what I was hearing around here is that Barack Obama is just like Hitler. And then they give all these things. I'm like, oh, God.
Well, you know about Godwin's law, right?
Explain it to me.
If I'm not going to get the exact wording right, but I think it essentially says that the longer a political debate goes on, the higher the likelihood of Hitler being invoked gets. And I'm just kind of thinking, I don't think a debate, I think Godwin's law needs to be reformed into it just happens now automatically. It's a given.
Yeah.
I give people credit who are creative enough to say Bernie Sanders is Chairman Mao. I mean, that's sort of, have you listened to Dan Carlin's Common Sense, his most recent one?
Yes. Yeah. Very good.
That is in my opinion, that is the only political commentary we need right now. Just that one episode. Because it's really just saying, look, we need to stop hating each other. And I don't know if he said it this way. I prefer to say we need to stop hating each other recreationally. That's the problem, because recreationally can become real very fast. I mean, if you look at how, football hooligans in the UK work. Now I'm going to get a bunch of hate because I don't even know what I'm talking about. I'm just saying, I know that they can get very violent. So yeah, it's very unsettling to me though, when people, well, it goes back to what I was saying about, people wishing harm on these protesters. It's just when you do that because it just makes you feel good, like online, like that, there's something it just doesn't fit with me, for whatever reason. It just doesn't fit. It seems like if these people were actively threatening your family and then going out and bragging about it at a protest or something, then maybe I'd get it. But beyond that, I don't know if I understand the glee, the perverse glee that people get from being cruel.
Right.
You know what I mean? So,
and that's kind of circling back whenever we were talking about human nature, like that. I'm a bit of a cynic whenever it comes to human nature. As a matter of fact,
me too.
my history classes, the very first day, we'll start off starting to talk about human nature, and I'll ask the question: Are people basically good, or are they basically evil? Most people, like this past year, whenever I asked that question, out of all my classes, I think I had one girl who said people are basically evil. Everybody else says that people are basically good. And I'll give the example. Do you have to teach a child to be bad?
No, you just give them a chance to be bad, and then they will be. Yeah.
Do you have to teach them to lie? Do you have to teach them to steal? It's none. Do you have to teach them to be violent? My wife is a preschool teacher.
Oh yeah.
You can go in to her preschool class, and if you were to just remove any authority or supervision or anything like that, and watch them play. Mm-hmm. Within 15 minutes, there's going to be one kid bashing another over the head with a block to take his toy.
I mean,
I say that's the basic bent of where people go, and you have to try to be good. And I think what you're saying about social media is people get a chance to vent the absolute worst parts of themselves.
I would never accuse Sigmund Freud of being a good scientist, but I think he might have been onto something when he talked about the id. I mean, that I think what he was really talking about was just sort of base instincts within humanity. I mean, he did essentially say that, but I think that, when you're talking about social media, I think you're looking at people who really they're just indulging in that side of them that they don't get to indulge in the real world because of social consequences, which are basically what the quote unquote super ego manifests, and the ego balances out both of the other aspects of the brain. But I was just thinking though that there's a great quote though from Daniele, and he and I kind of touched on this in our interview that we did, that I think when talking about adults, I think you're right when talking about kids, it's a different animal because they haven't fully developed yet. But when talking about adults, I think Daniele is onto something when he says he doesn't think that humans are innately good or innately bad. He thinks they're innately weak. And I thought that was an interesting way of looking at it, that they are, well, let's jump back to ordinary men.
Okay.
Those men were not evil. They did evil things. They were ordinary men, but they were weak by any moral metric because they were coerced into doing evil things. That could be a way to explain it. I think it's reasonable, at least, is a good way of saying it.
Yeah. I think that's reasonable.
I
don't know. Again, whenever you look at history, in places where like law breaks down, authority breaks down, it doesn't take long before people start eating each other.
Literally.
And start brutalizing each other.
It's true.
And it takes some sort of outside force in order to rein it all in, and in order for them to, for lack of a better term, be good. So I don't know.
It's tough to say. I think that like what's interesting, and I've heard a lot of people talking about this with the pandemic, saying like, oh, well, and frankly, I like his podcast, but Joe Rogan was saying this, and I'm kind of like, it's kind of easy for you to say that when you have a giant bunker full of, adult man toys, to say that everybody should just be chill and just be friendly with each other, and how this is it's going to show everybody how we help each other and whatnot. And I'm thinking, yeah, that's the thing. And this is something, I don't know if this has ever been, this is just sort of my observation. It can be, I'm just pulling it out of my ass, frankly. Well, keeping it PG-13 here. But the theory though that I have is that yes, people on smaller scales will be good to each other for a period of time. We'll say 10 days. I don't made up number. Point is, it's a short period of time. I think the reason why there might have been an increase in anecdotal evidence of people being good to each other after this pandemic hit and people started being more aware of how this is a very serious thing, it was because they saw a light at the end of the tunnel. And now we're like 2 months later, 3 months later, cut to 4 or 5 months later, and we're hearing that these quarantine efforts are being extended probably. Things are going to get worse. There's going to be a spike after we relax the quarantines. Yeah. It's like, it's going to remind people that, oh no, there is no light at the end of the tunnel of this. We don't know where that light is going to be. So screw it, whatever. I got nothing to lose. That combined with and this is sort of why I think people are good to each other a lot of the time. And this is where I become a really big cynic, is that I think people tend to be good because it feels good to be good, but also because there is a sort of hope for reward for being good. And when there's no light at the end of the tunnel, then you're not going to get rewarded anytime soon. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, I think it comes from either some sort of internal change or external consequence that people are good.
Well, and it's great though when there's stories in history, and there's plenty of stories in history where there are those exceptions to the rule. Because I agree with you that it is largely the rule, but those stories of countless stories throughout World War II of people risking their own lives to save Jews, like those are great, powerful stories. We love those stories for a reason, and I think it's because they're exceptions.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We were talking, I mean, this keeps kind of cycling back and forth and weaving in and out and everything. We were talking about the pandemic and everything, and people's reactions to it. Right before school got dismissed, I told my students, because we had talked about this. We talked about the 1918 pandemic. 3 or 4 weeks before all of this broke loose. And I said, this might be the canary in the coal mine. So this might not be a bad thing. This might be a wake-up call for all of us. I said, right now, the mortality rate, I don't want to downplay any deaths because they're all tragic.
Of course.
Mortality rate is 1% or 2% or something like that.
On a global scale. In the United States it's a little higher, but I think that's getting skewed by New York City a little bit. Yeah. I
said, what if this was the big one? You know, what if this was like a repeat of the Spanish flu, where we're talking like a minimum of 50 million people dying?
Oh, yeah. Or the Black Plague.
How are people going to react then?
Yeah.
You think the rush on toilet paper and hair dye is bad now? What do they do if this is like a really mean one?
Yeah. And that's the question I think more people should be asking. And I think honestly, the only people who do think about it, besides doomsday preppers, are history fans. I think because we've read about this stuff, we're just like, oh no, this is not good. I mean, I think we do have an advantage, and thankfully, it does look like the projections have seemed to have gone down. I'm not pretending I know anything about that stuff. I'm just saying that I think it could be good that it is good that it's not as bad as it could be, but at the same time, like it's a very good indicator, I agree, of what the real big one's going to be, because we might be able to develop a vaccine for this, but what if we get the super Black Plague? You know what I mean? Something that we just can't fight. It's too virulent. And yeah, I don't know. It's I think the one thing that concerns me the most, though, is indeed how people are reacting to it. And I want to believe that will end, or ease down, but I don't think it will. And honestly, I think all forms of media, social or otherwise, are enabling that kind of sort of psychological, emotional breakdown. I just don't like it.
Yeah. Well, and that's one thing that's different now that they didn't have 100 years ago. I'm convinced that I could go on the internet and pull up a picture of a blank, empty shelf somewhere and post it and start a panic if I wanted to.
If you knew what you were doing and knew where to post it, you could. Yeah.
And that's, I think that's the second thing that makes this a lot more dangerous. Because you have the people that overreact, and then the normal, regular people have to react to the people who are overreacting, in order to ensure that, they don't get left behind. It's a crazy spiral.
Well, it was, because I remember when the whole toilet paper thing started, I remember just being like, why do people want toilet paper so much? I just didn't understand it. And then I found some article that was talking about how it's tied to sort of this primordial need to feel clean, I guess. It's like we connect it to our most vulnerable state, which is when we're on the toilet. and there are certain people who are really sensitive to that. And that explained the shortage. But then I was thinking, that doesn't explain the full shortage. And then I realized, oh no, this is a social exponent kind of thing, where those people who are very sensitive to that will buy a bunch of toilet paper. Then everybody else starts to hear about everyone's buying toilet paper. So then they go out and buy toilet paper, and then it just gets worse and worse and worse.
Then the snowball starts rolling then.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's sort of why I feel like I wanted to find a story about a moral panic, because I feel like you could draw parallels like with any kind of moral panic. There's the one thing I was thinking about was the satanic panic of the 1980s. Like that resulted in some pretty horrifying things, like the West Memphis 3 come to mind. So, but I was going to say, though, the one thing that I thought was really interesting, and obviously it's not the same disease, but it was scary at the time, was swine flu in 2010. Yeah. And the interesting thing about swine flu in 2010 was we had Facebook, we had Twitter, and we had a sort of, the media wasn't as sensationalistic back then, I don't think, but so that probably plays into it. But I want to, the fact that we had those things back then and we have them now, that says to me that something in the social psychology changed. Like, because I've heard people say, oh, well, the panic is so bad right now because of social media. And I'm saying, yeah, but we had that before. So something's different.
We had the social media. I don't think that we had the same attitudes and usage.
That's what I
think too, I could be looking back through rose-colored glasses. Mm-hmm. I don't remember it being as ugly.
Me too. And you know what? Okay, this could be an exponential effect, like what I just described with the toilet paper. You know what? Let's say it's a roll of toilet paper rolling down a hill. How about that? But like, yeah, maybe things just started to ramp up with how people use social media. We'll say the anger, the outrage machine or something like that. Yeah. And then, there was a new thing, then there was a new thing, there was a new thing. And then the more often that happened, the more normal it became to be nasty online as a default. Yeah. Like it obviously ramped up even higher the closer we got to the 2016 election. And then of course it was just going to keep going afterward. That's not just going to go away.
I think it's almost like a social media nuclear arms race where
that's a really good parallel.
where, okay. So the right during the Barack Obama years brought a knife.
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to go get a gun.
No.
The next side, they go get, a bazooka, and then the other side gets a tank. And everybody's just got to get bigger and meaner and nastier memes that they can throw at the other side.
And
go ahead. Sorry. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, well, my friend that I was talking to, I talked to a number of my friends about this kind of stuff all the time. One of them is a friend who's not keyed into social media at all. He just disconnected back in like 2013 or something. He just had enough. So he must have seen some canary in the coal mine. I don't know. I think it was somebody yelling at him, and he was just like, I don't like how I feel when I get yelled at by a stranger. So I'm not doing this anymore. But I've talked to him about it. I've talked to another friend of mine who's very keyed into social media. And I think what they both have kind of interestingly said is my friend who's disconnected from social media has said, oh, this is going to get way, 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 way worse. And then my friend who's not disconnected from social media is saying, oh, no, this is never going to get real. This is less likely to spill into the real world than I think people are worried about, because his argument is that because we're expending all our anger just typing away at our keyboards, that by the time we're done typing away, we're tired. So we're not going to go out and try to start a riot or anything. And honestly, that kind of seems like a common sense answer. That is how anger works. It goes big and then it fizzles out, and you are exhausted afterward when you're mad.
Yeah, man, I don't know how healthy that is, though.
I'm not saying it's healthy. I'm just saying it's better that it's being expended online than in the real world. The question is, will that spillover eventually happen? And if the internet gets shut down somehow because of the pandemic, yeah, it's going to happen. I shouldn't laugh, but I'm laughing at the absurdity of it, I guess. So let me ask you something then, because you are I'm now turning the tables again. I'm doing the interview. Since your thing is doing travel, essentially, is this like frustrating for you since you can't go anywhere now?
It's, a little bit.
Okay.
And I don't want to. I think there's a little bit of a misconception
Sure.
as far as what I do.
Okay.
I think a lot of people think that, wow, he travels here and he travels there and he, went to France and Belgium. He's independently wealthy. And no, most of the videos that I make are in conjunction with a trip that I'm already doing. So like whenever I went to DC, I got a grant to go out and spend a couple days at the Naval Academy learning about what they do. And then
That's
I just
awesome,
stayed,
though.
yeah. And then I just stayed in DC for a couple extra days.
Sure.
So, the cost of that was covered.
Yeah.
It's, as far as what this has done to some of my plans, like I mentioned, I was supposed to be going to Rome, and I was gonna do some content creation there. Well, that's all gone now. And then we were planning on, doing a vacation. Doesn't look like that's going to happen. So
yeah.
So it's definitely putting a squeeze on what I do. It's, it's not like life altering or anything like that. There's, a lot of people that it is life altering for them. But yeah, I'm gonna have to get a little bit creative as far as what I can do maybe locally.
I was gonna say doing interviews like this is good too. So you know, it definitely gives you something to do as well. But and you mentioned that it hasn't really affected your life that much. I should acknowledge that the weirdest thing about this pandemic for me, it has literally not affected my life at all. And
Really?
that's because I'm an independent contractor. I do copy editing for paid work.
Oh, okay.
Which I don't think I've ever announced on a podcast before, but that's what I do if people are wondering. So that's given me a lot of freedom to start my own podcast. That was one reason I did it, because I was thinking, I don't know how much longer I'm going to be doing this gig, so I should start a podcast. And it turns out they both are very conducive to one another. But the thing is, for both, I work from home. I guess the only real impact that I felt to my professional life is I can't go to the library. And that's it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I'm happy to, buy books too. I love having a lot of books to read.
Right.
So yeah, it's, so thinking about that, how weird that is, has kind of helped me appreciate the kind of luck that I have and that Molly has and that people like you have, at least because you have the ability to create stuff still.
Yeah.
But it's I can't even imagine what it's like for the average food service worker. I'm in LA. What is it? 80% of people here are self-employed. I can't even imagine what it's like for a lot of them. I have a lot of friends who are in the film industry as editors and prop work and stuff like that. And they're out of a job. They have to file for unemployment, and it's scary. So I count myself really lucky.
Yeah. Here's what I'm hoping is going to happen, and it's the bright point. So again, if we look at history, the book that I mentioned earlier that I was reading about the flu pandemic.
Yeah.
One of the points that was made in the book is that afterwards you have 50 to 100 million people globally that are dead.
Yeah. I can't even imagine that number, by the way. That just...
especially in proportion to what the global population was at the time.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, that's probably looking at 200 million dead today.
Maybe even more, honestly. I can't even, that's crazy.
So, you take that many people out of the equation, that's, okay, so then, 50 to 100 million less workers, 50 to 100 million less people that are buying products globally. It's going to have a huge effect on the economy. But what they found was we have the roaring 20s right after this decade of just huge economic prosperity. So I'm hoping that everybody's going to be pent up right now. And then once this thing settles, there's going to be a surge where people are going out and they're going to restaurants and they're traveling and they're doing all of these things. So I'm trying to be optimistic
Sure. But then the historian and the history fan has to jump in and say, yeah, what happened at the end of the Roaring '20s?
Well, yes. So I also had that thought.
Yeah.
It's all cyclical.
It is, yeah. Well, let's just make sure that people can't, rampantly speculate and try to farm out loans that people can't afford, that kind of thing. Let's try to be responsible, and then maybe we'll have a good decade after this. So yeah, one does have to wonder though, like if the sort of this boost you're talking about, it's like an optimism, I guess, a sort of renewed optimism because the worst is over. We survived a war. We survived a pandemic. Let's go out and spend and buy and enjoy life and all that. And you think that social attitude maybe, and this is just me asking because I don't know nearly enough about the beginning. Oh, I have a cat here. Maybe that sort of freewheeling attitude helped contribute to the speculation that started to occur that allowed something like the Great Depression to happen. I mean,
yeah,
I don't know. I mean,
it'd be interesting for somebody smarter than me to look at and figure out.
Smarter than me too. Because I don't know. You know what? I'll ask Molly. She's an economics major. She probably could answer that question. Yeah. So I like that view. I do want to believe that could be the big turnaround. I actually had a question, and I've seen answers, but I'm just curious on your take. The Spanish flu, as you've mentioned, 50 to 100 million people dead. It's huge. It was even more destructive than the First World War, where it really got its start. Why do you think people don't really know about it, or why it doesn't really have that giant impact on the collective consciousness that, say, the World War I or World War II have? Is it because it's not a war?
I honestly think that's it.
Okay.
I think that it's so closely, butted up against the First World War that the First World War just sucks all of the oxygen out of the room. Because right after that, you have the Treaty of Versailles, and then you have this cascade effect that leads directly into World War II. And oddly enough, the Spanish flu, up until 3 months ago, seems to have got lost in the shuffle there.
And I can't imagine for a second that something that destructive and something that probably made a lot of people very scared didn't play a part in that cascade effect leading from the First World War to the Second. That has to play a part. I mean, the most definitive book I've read about the first half of the 20th century, I don't know if you've read it, is Neil Ferguson's War of the World.
No.
Oh, it's a great book. It's like 850 pages long. It's massive. It's a great book. And he talks, and he has like an economics perspective, and it's been several years since I read it, so I could be wrong, but I don't think he even devotes a page to the Spanish flu. But I could be wrong. He might mention it, but I find it very hard to believe it didn't play a part in everything, And I kind of get it at the time why people might not have like kept the story alive, because World War I was so traumatic on its own. It was sort of like the Spanish flu was kicking humanity while it was down.
Yeah.
And it was just like, let's just not even think about it. I don't want to deal with that,
What's weird is that you would think that even if the focus is solely on World War I, you would have to mention the Spanish flu because it was so pivotal to the outcome of World War I.
Yeah, didn't like the Germans, they were way more likely to lose because of it, right?
Yeah. Ludendorff said that he felt that he lost because of the Spanish flu.
Yeah.
That during the spring offensive, it just wiped out his combat effectiveness of his troops.
We've all had the flu. It's, the last thing you want to do is pick up a gun and fight if you have the flu.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And okay. You know what? Here's another silver lining about COVID. We might get that book finally that makes that argument that, hey, we shouldn't downplay the Spanish flu. This was big. This was the biggest of the big when it comes to things in the 20th century.
Yeah. So here's what's weird is at the very beginning of the current series that I have in France and Belgium.
Yeah.
The first episode, I think it was the first one. I can't remember my own stuff. I go to, I can't pronounce the name because it's French, and I just butcher every French.
I am terrible at pronouncing French. I had one French name on my last podcast, and I was just like babbling over it. I mean, if you heard the uncut footage of me saying the name, I say it like 17 times before I finally get it. So
but I go to a cemetery right on the outskirts of Paris.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think it's pronounced Suriname.
Oh, yeah.
It's a World War I cemetery. So you go in there expecting that you're going to see all of these people that died during World War I, and all of the deaths, well, not all of them, but a vast majority of them are December 1918, January 1919, February 1919. It's just one Spanish flu death after another. Yeah, there again, you very rarely ever hear about it. The only reason I knew anything about it is whenever I was a kid, I go to my great grandma and grandpa's house, and there was an old picture up there, one of those oval pictures.
That
has like the big bubble glass on it.
Yeah.
And it's a picture of two little boys standing next to each other. And my grandma told me that was your great grandpa's older brothers. It was Emmett and Gilbert, and they died during the flu epidemic. And then she told me about it. That's the only reason I ever knew anything about it. I never learned about it in school or college or anything.
Yeah. Well, you were lucky that you had someone in your family that it was a living memory for them, because I think like the oldest person in my family, he's now deceased, was my grandfather, but he was born in 1918. So, I should count myself lucky he was fine, because he would have been one of the most vulnerable ones, right? Because he was an infant.
Yeah. The infants and older people were actually the most immune.
Oh, really?
The ones that were at the highest risk were young, healthy men.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean,
it results in something called a cytokine storm, where your body overreacts and shuts down. So, yeah.
That is mind blowing to me. But I mean, this is actually something that, because I remember earlier on in this pandemic, I started to see those. This is just what I do. I'm taking a very dark turn. It's a very dark, sharp left turn. But my first worry, and this is when I started thinking about the social and psychological ramifications of this whole thing, was when I saw the increased instances of racist attacks against Asian people because of this.
Yes.
And it was in New York. It was in Indiana, though. Honestly, Indiana. This is a weird fact about Illinois outside of Chicago. There is a very specific kind of racism towards Asian people in Illinois, and it spills into Indiana. I don't know why. It's just something I've heard about it. But anyway, that made me start thinking about it. And I was like, if this gets bad enough, this is like, pogrom city is what I was thinking. But then I read this piece that I, for the life of me, don't remember where it was, but it was a guy who was taking a sort of historical psychological perspective on it. And so, of course, it was right up my alley. And he said, the good news, if there is good news about a pandemic, about COVID, is that it doesn't affect children disproportionately, like the Black Plague did.
Yeah.
And he said that when a plague disproportionately affects children, that's when you see the scapegoating starting to happen. Yeah. And because the Black Plague is a very interesting one that I know a little bit about. I know that it was so devastating that it was, I think, the most devastating thing that's ever hit humanity in recorded history in terms of proportion of population. Because I believe it was like 200 million dead with a global population of less than 1 billion or something. Yeah. And it lowered the carbon footprint of humanity. It was so bad. Yeah,
I think it's the only time that there's been negative human population growth in human history.
Yeah, I believe so. Like on a global scale, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And they, but one of the really unpleasant consequences of it killing, well, it didn't just kill children. It killed everybody, but it killed children in large numbers. And that led to people across Europe accusing Jews of doing it, of poisoning. That's where the term poisoning the well comes from.
Yeah.
And like, and what he was explaining was that it's just part of our sort of biological or biopsychological drive to get more outraged about cruelties visited upon children, even if it's just acts of God. And that does make me feel a little bit better about this, even though we still are hearing about, awful things being said, at least to Asian people. And, but if this I've always semi-jokingly said, if a new mutation happens and starts hitting children, I'm forbidding Molly from going outside. Because and her family, you're not going outside. Sorry. I'm not letting it happen. So, yeah.
And it's unfortunate where that has happened. It's unfortunate that people can't differentiate between the Chinese government
exactly
and Chinese people, because there's definitely some problems going on in China.
I mean, do we even have to talk about what's happening to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang? I mean, that's like almost on the level of Joseph Stalin kind of stuff. It's evil. I mean, beyond belief.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, if we're looking at silver linings, I hope this kind of shines a spotlight that Chinese government, maybe people need to be taking, some second looks at how we do things.
Like what kind of relationship we have with them. I think we're the understanding I have is that currently our economic ties are just so strong that we can't just divorce ourselves from them. It's not possible, economically speaking. I don't know. I can't really speak to that. I have talked to a number of friends of mine who seem to think that, I was one of those people who was in support of the Hong Kong protesters, for example, because, I'm a sucker for anybody who waves an American flag and says, give me my freedom of speech. But I also recognize that Hong Kong is different from mainland China. And something that a lot of my friends who are thinking that, China maybe will start democratizing if they get hit hard enough by a pandemic, which I'm like, that's kind of a perverse way to look at a silver lining, but whatever. Okay. But I've said that I would say to them, I should say, that the one thing that I don't think a lot of Westerners, specifically Americans, understand about China is that China has never been a free society, ever.
No.
Like, before communism, they were I don't even want to say Chiang Kai-shek was a democratic sort of fella. I don't think he was.
He was awful.
He was an awful person. So we can agree the CCP gets one thing right. Chiang Kai-shek was an awful person.
He was an awful person. It just got replaced with a more awful person.
Exactly. But before him, Sun Yat-sen, from what I know of him, wasn't the worst, but again, not a great guy. Before that was the Qing dynasty, who weren't even Han Chinese. They were Manchus. And they were ruling for 350 years or something. And every single time someone tried to rise up, it just turned into a nasty conflagration. Like the story I'm currently studying right now about this American mercenary, Frederick Townsend Ward, he fought in the Taiping Rebellion for the Manchus against the Taipings. Are you aware of that story, really?
No. When it comes to Chinese history, that's kind of a blind spot for me.
Sure. Okay, well, I can tell you, first of all, that Daniele is releasing a 3-part series on the Taiping Rebellion soon. So
nice.
Yeah, so that can give you a good crash course on it. It's really interesting. But the short version, whenever I say the short version, I'm always getting ready to go into a 15-minute monologue. But I'll try to keep it short. The short version is that in the 1840s, this guy named Hong Shuchuan was trying to take one of the imperial entrance exams, and he kept failing them. So he went kind of crazy, and he had a vision, and he believed, because he had picked up a pamphlet from a Christian missionary, he believed that the vision was God, and that God was talking to him, and that there was a man in the vision as well, and that man was Jesus. So then he came to the conclusion later on that he was Jesus Christ's younger brother. No joke. And then from there, he created a movement, a sort of pseudo-Christian movement, his own I kind of was referring to him as the Chinese Joseph Smith in a way. He created his own version that was tied into his own national mythology a little bit. And then he ended up, but unlike Joseph Smith, he ended up creating a giant rebellious movement that created something called the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. There was a big civil war, and anywhere from 20 to 40 million people died in it. It's the most destructive war besides World War II in human history.
And see, that's where, okay, so I went to the American Cemetery at Normandy. And in that video, I make the point that if you take every single person killed in the Iraq and Afghanistan war, it still wouldn't fill that cemetery. So you look at like 20, 40 million people dying. It makes you realize, as bad as things may seem now, regardless of, you know, if Barack Obama's in office or Donald Trump or whether we have, you know, COVID-19, we're probably living in the best period of human history that has ever existed.
We objectively are. And by every measure of global health, for lack of a better word, like infant mortality rates at an all-time low, life expectancy is, I believe, as high as it's ever been. I did hear that it dipped, I think, recently, but it might just be because of COVID. I don't know. Don't quote me on that. I don't remember where I saw that. It was just somebody shooting their mouth off on social media, I'm sure. By almost every objective measure, we are living a great time, during a great time. Steven Pinker wrote that one book called The Better Angels of Our Nature that gets into that. I haven't read it, but I hear it referenced constantly, most recently constantly by Joe Rogan, because he seems to love saying that because he wants to be an optimist, I guess. But it's true, though, that we do live in a great time. And what that says to me, though, is not that like we shouldn't complain. I think we should have perspective before we complain, though, if that makes sense.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think, but when you look at the Taiping Rebellion, it does kind of boggle the mind. Like, how do we not know about that? Well, mostly because it was in China, but Americans were involved. I mean, all the great powers were involved, but it was mostly just Chinese people killing Chinese people. And interestingly enough, given how the CCP feels about Christianity, they revere the Taiping Rebellion only because it was an anti-imperialist rebellion. Like Mao loved to invoke Hong Xiuquan, even though every policy the Chinese Party has had, a Communist Party has had against religious people in general, but especially Christians, has been monstrous.
What you're saying is people cherry picking history and using it for their own purposes is nothing new.
Yeah, nothing new. Weaponizing it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that does make me sad. The weaponization of history does make me sad. I won't pretend I don't do that a little bit myself, though. I'm going to call myself out. I do weaponize a lot of the historical stories I tell, in the sense that I try to like remind people, hey, this thing that you're doing or saying or thinking right now is not original. This is something that's happened before, and that you need to like understand that it could lead to something really bad. That seems to be what I end up going for a lot of the time.
Right.
So yeah, I don't know. That's, I think, also one reason I really like your channel is because you just give the information and a really great tour while doing it.
It's a glorified show and tell.
Well, see, you know what? I would love to see this continue on into the mid 2020s when VR becomes even more ubiquitous and you have your own VR camera on your iPhone or something. because honestly, like, it's funny. The last video of yours I was watching was the one where you went to Ford's Theater in DC. And I was in DC last summer rather. And I was only there for like 8 hours. So I didn't have time to go to a lot of stuff. I went to the Holocaust Museum because I had never been. And it was amazing, but it was horrifying at the same time.
Right.
And
right.
But now that I have seen your video on Ford's Theater, I am going next time I'm there, because that hallway leading up to the balcony was the coolest thing I have ever seen in a museum.
Yeah. That's kind of what I hope for is there's been so many times that I've gone someplace and I don't know, I can't even think of an example offhand, but I'll go someplace. Sure. And then I get home and I start reading and researching about where I went. And I'm like, gosh, I wish I would have known that before I went. I would have appreciated that so much more. I would have, learned more about that. So I just posted a video from whenever I went to Pointe du Hoc, where the Rangers scaled the cliffs on D-Day. It's, just like this legendary story from the U.S. military history. And I was in the observation bunker right there on the point. This amazing place. And I was kind of waiting for people to clear out because what people don't see is taking a camera and pointing it at yourself and then talking to it like an idiot in the middle of a crowd. It is so awkward.
You just haven't gotten used to it despite doing it so many times.
I hate it. I hate it.
Well, you could just do a podcast. At this point, I think you've established yourself, though, as being on camera, so you're stuck.
I'll circle back around to that because I considered doing a podcast at one point. But while I was there, right there in the observation bunker, I looked over, and there's this family, and there's this little girl that looked to be 11 or 12 years old, and she's got her phone out and is playing some goofy game. Has her head down, not looking at anything around her. And I thought, how sad. Because one of these days, this girl is going to learn about this, and she's going to say, I wish that I would have been paying more attention.
I hope she has that realization and not just, I can't believe I didn't get past that level on Angry Birds. I am so out of touch. I don't know what kids are playing these days.
Yeah.
But yeah. Well, I mean, we're talking like a girl who's like maybe like 8 or 9 doing that.
A little older than that.
Okay. Oh, so she's in that mode of just, I don't care what mom and dad want me to see.
Yeah.
She's not going to care no matter what. But yeah, that is a shame.
Which
that does make me really sad.
I don't blame her.
Sure. Yeah.
Her parents, I should have,
they should have said, leave your phone in the car or wherever. Yeah.
Or, hey, let me explain to you where we are.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, you mentioned a podcast. I seriously considered starting a podcast at one point.
Like a traditional history podcast?
Yeah.
Okay.
Had it all mapped out, had a bunch of research done, stuff like that. And then got to thinking, why would I do this to myself?
That's a good question. That's a really good question.
How much? Okay, so this last podcast that you did, on Mongolia, how much time went into that? I know the final product was 36 hours or something.
It was only 5 for the record. That actually took even more time because I also was researching for an episode. 2 episodes I collaborated with Daniele on, where he recently did a 2-parter on Baron von Ungern Sternberg, the Bloody Baron, who plays a part in the podcast. But so I was doing research on him. And then I was like, I want to do a companion episode, but I obviously can't just talk about him. So let's see. There's this book I have called Red Shambhala. And I started reading it. And I was just using it as flavor research. And then when I started reading it, I realized, oh, there's a lot here. So then I just started expanding. So including the books I read while researching and helping Daniele with his episode, I want to say I did leave a source list on my website, on the blog. So if you want to see the specific books I used most, they're on there. But overall, I ended up using 5 or 6 full books and several different articles that I was able to find on academia.edu, which is a really helpful resource. I think all in all, I read something close to 3,000 pages. For this particular episode. Some episodes require a lot more research than others. Obviously, this one just based on length alone does. But the last one I did about Eric Lomax and the Pacific Theater, that was only 3 books, really, 3 full books. The American Executioners, that was a shorter episode, but that was like 4 or 5 books or something like that.
Okay.
Which is funny because there's actually not that many sources about that aspect of Dachau. There's only like 1 or 2 books about that covered the reprisal killings. I mean, I was reading the official, I think it was a 7th Army General Report. I actually was able to get that for $4 on Amazon, which is really nice. So yeah, it basically just depends on the episode, but on average, I'm usually reading, anywhere from 500 pages to 3,000 pages per episode. And then I have to write it. And that's, that takes a while too.
Yeah. Whenever I was in the thinking stage of it and, was reading books and everything like that, I got to thinking, oh, okay, this is why Carlin only releases 1 episode, every 8 months.
Yeah, but then remember what he said in his recent Common Sense. He said he tried, 30 some times to release a Common Sense episode. I'm thinking he probably does that a bit with Hardcore History. Like he probably records something, decides he doesn't like it, and then starts over from scratch. I don't think he scripts anything from what I know.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
I get that.
Sure.
I get that. Most of the videos that I do, it's kind of like, well, there it is. You know, I'm dissatisfied with most of the stuff that I put out.
Well, I mean, you're really being a tour guide, honestly, in your videos. And I think that you're doing your job really well. And you always give good background flavor context at the beginning, middle, and end. One of your most interestingly poignant episodes was when you went to, oh man, I'm going to forget the name of where you were, but it was, you found that gentleman in the park who who toured you around. And there was the museum for where that, or was the church, was it Birmingham?
Yeah.
And it was a church where those girls were killed in that bombing, which is, I knew that story vaguely, but then I watched your video and I didn't realize how awful that story was. That is a horrible story. I mean, it's a great story, but it's horrible, you know?
Yeah. So that guy,
yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
He lives in that park. He was homeless.
Wow. Okay.
And he, you know, approaches me and, you know, starts talking to me and everything like that. So ended up being just a phenomenal tour guide.
So he knew everything about the park and about the church and everything. Yeah.
Everything. Yeah. And lived through it, you know, was there during that era.
Yeah.
So
I remember.
you know, firsthand knowledge of it and saw a lot of things himself. What was his name? Anthony. Anthony is that guy's name.
What's the name of the video? Because I mean, people listening or watching should look it up because I feel like that's a really good video you did.
What's it? I think it's called a KKK church bombing in Birmingham.
Man, that's a good title.
Yeah.
I got my attention. All you got to do is just put 3 Ks next to each other and people will be like, okay, what is this?
Yeah.
Actually, speaking of which, I'm just curious, did that video get any flack from YouTube or from people for that matter? But like, if you don't want to get into that, we don't have to.
No,
but you want to talk about, okay, because YouTube is an interesting beast right now.
It is, as well as Facebook on that kind of stuff.
Wait, has Facebook gone after you?
Yeah. I got a 1-week suspension from Facebook over one of my World War II videos.
I remember you mentioned that. Yeah. That is just, how come? Well, it's because I don't post as often as you is probably why I don't get flagged. I mean, like, I posted an icon, a link to my werewolves episode. It has a werewolf in front of a swastika. Nothing happened to me. So I don't know. I think it has to do with how often you post, and maybe because it's video, maybe it's, who knows?
I don't know. But I posted that video, KKK church bombing in Birmingham. And I was like, all right, here we go. Full send. We're going to see what happens here. Nothing. I thought, oh, okay. And
but your World War II videos, like, that are completely innocuously titled,
those get gigged. Yeah. So another one that got gigged was whenever I went to a German cemetery in Normandy. I got flack on that one from Facebook and YouTube both, and it's not like
Facebook and Team YouTube. Yeah,
it's not like some individual sitting there, like trolling through my page and then just hitting it because he doesn't like it. It's their algorithm can't differentiate between some dummy in a black hat stumbling around talking about Nazis and a Nazi.
Yeah. Well, and see, that's my issue is that, like, as far as, people who seem to be totally okay with YouTube's oversight on free speech on the internet would just say, oh, well, this guy in the black hat talking about Nazis, if he gets flagged and censored, well, that means he is a Nazi.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a couple chuckleheads who probably would say that, but like that's
like a couple of Hitler's speeches, like videos of him giving a speech,
just archive footage.
Got pulled. And it's because
didn't they get put in? Yeah. The I brought them up. The Great War Channel. They got completely demonetized at one point, if I remember right, because they were talking about the precursor to World War II and to the rise of the Nazi Party, just because they talked about it.
Right. Yeah. So that's, and I get it. YouTube's not a publicly held company, is it? Is it private?
They're part of Google, so it would depend on if Google's publicly held.
Okay, all right, yeah, they are.
Yeah. Okay.
So they're responsible to their shareholders and
and advertisers. There's that too.
And advertisers. Okay, so you don't want to have some white nationalist or something like that, posting on your platform, maybe. So I get it. I understand it. I wish that there was a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? Due process.
Yeah.
The video or suspending the account, try and learn a little bit more about.
The algorithm has to get better. There's that too. I mean, that is a big, I actually understand why they started using machine learning to handle this kind of thing, is because the sheer number of videos that go up every day, it's impossible to track. And you hear a lot of heeing and hawing, and maybe rightly so, about who specifically ends up getting targeted the most when others stay up. But I think it has more to do with just the AI only can do so much, Right. And on top of that, here's me being a conspiracy theorist. I'll put my tinfoil hat on if I have it on hand. But I get the feeling that the reason why, because you hear this said a lot, why do historical videos or right-wing videos get taken off YouTube when ISIS videos stay up? And my answer to that is because the government probably wants to know where they can find the ISIS videos. I think it's more of an issue on Twitter, less on YouTube. But but I get it. I do get it too. And I would imagine that the reason why you have to do because you were telling me that you're now notifying YouTube for every video you're doing, they're actually trying to put a human touch on the whole process, which is good.
That's a step in the right direction. So
exactly.
Now whenever I upload a video, I have to self-report. And some of the stuff that I have to self-report is a little bit strange. So I have to report if there's any language in the video that could get it, demonetized. I have to report if there's any guns in the video, which that one hurt my feelings.
Well, okay. So did you have to report, for example, or would you have to report, because I don't know if this was in place at the time, the Ford's Theater episode, because you show the Derringer that John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln with?
Yeah. I don't know. This is so fresh at this point that I'm still kind of learning it myself. It kind of brings up a larger point.
Sure.
About, I don't know, censorship, I guess. I kind of lean towards, there's some people out there that have some horrible ideas that are absolutely terrible, racist, disgusting, everything like that.
Yeah.
And what I've found is that a lot of times whenever those people have their ideas out there, one of two things. The bad part is those people find each other easier now.
Yeah, and they can also maybe convince a couple handful of disaffected, angry young men, for example.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's bad.
On the flip side of it, just what I've seen in my own personal experience is a lot of times whenever those bad ideas get out there, like the planet has a way of kind of policing itself. So I don't know. I'm trying to think. For example, okay, so I had a student one time that moved into our school. Was a sophomore. This kid was straight up white nationalist, KKK loving, Nazi sympathizer.
Well, how much? And just quick question: was he a true believer, that level of scary, or was he just like a kid who was angry and found something edgy to get behind?
This wasn't the edgy kid who, like flashes a Nazi salute to be funny. Like this, this kid was the real deal, and would write like KKK stuff in his book and in his notebook and swastikas and all that kind of stuff. Freaked a lot of people out.
Understandably so.
Understandably.
Yeah.
My approach to that kid was just to engage him in conversation. And I don't know how this is going to sound. I hope it doesn't sound bad.
Well, I won't think it will, because I think I know where you're going with this, but continue.
but to show interest. Like, oh, okay, so why is it that you think that that white people are the dominant superior race. So he can go through all of his stuff. And have you read Guns, Germs, and Steel?
That is like one of those books that's on my shelf. You know what
Okay.
I mean?
All right.
But I know about it, of course.
Well, I'll start ripping pages out of that.
Okay.
And we start having a conversation. Now, long story short, by the time this kid was a senior, pretty much all of that went away. A lot of those real far radical racist beliefs had kind of melted away. Now, maybe that has to do with maturity.
Yeah, his age. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That could be part of it.
Or maybe it's because somebody in his life didn't completely freak out and try and get him kicked out of school and actually engaged him with real history and, with indisputable facts. And I think that here, I say all that to say this: whenever you start trying to deplatform people and, tear down this, tear down that, destroy this, destroy that, I think what you do is you take those individuals and you force them into a dark corner. And that's, to me, where it gets a little bit dangerous or ugly.
Yeah. And it also kind of feeds into that. And this is, I believe, something that I think even the FBI has talked about, is that where when you try to well, no, why am I saying the FBI? I don't know where I got that from, but just, it's the idea that radicalism is kind of like mushrooms. They frankly, they eat shit and they thrive in the dark. I mean, that's what happens. And if you push them into the dark, they're going to get worse. That's the point I'm trying to make. And I think that that's a big part of it. I do think that at the end of the day, there is hope this is where I sound like a weird optimist, but there is hope for a lot of people. And I think that kind of story is an example of that. Daryl Davis, how he de-radicalized however many members of the KKK, adult men who are members of the KKK. Have you heard about him?
No, I'm not familiar with that story.
He's pretty famous. He was on Rogan recently. He's a black man who's a musician by trade, who once when playing a show in Chicago, I believe it was Chicago. That doesn't matter where he was. He was playing a show, and this guy came up to him after the show and said, that was really great. I love, I've never seen you in this band before, because he was filling in for a guy. And as he got to talking to this guy who kept saying really weird things, because at the time, Daryl doesn't know that this guy is a member of the KKK. And the guy just is kind of baffled the whole time, just I never thought I would get along with someone like you. And Daryl's just a musician? And then eventually it just came out that the guy was a member of the KKK. And by simply talking to him and showing interest in him as a person, he just cut the sort of hatred melted away. Now, I don't think that should be seen as the rule for everybody, because I do think there are people who just are never capable of changing because they have no incentive to.
Right.
And I think a lot of those people, to loop it back around to my love of psychology, I think those people they're just not psychologically in the right place to change, especially if the people you really have to be scared of are the ones who you could say are legitimate psychopaths who also have horrible beliefs. They're not only not going to change, they're actively looking to get people to follow them a lot of the time. So, but you can't weed that out. So, you also made me think of a story. I knew a kid in high school who was not only a legit white nationalist, he was like a neo-Nazi. And he kept trying to be friends with me. And I didn't know at the time all this about him.
Yeah.
And then he started talking about how he'd been persecuted because he had been accused of a bomb threat the year before. And I had remembered the bomb threat because they evacuated the school, and he hadn't sent the bomb threat in. It actually had been revealed that a black girl, had put the bomb threat in to try to frame him. And then, of course, my thought was, well, why would she bother trying to frame him? You can take a wild guess at why he thinks she tried to frame him. But really what it was is because he was harassing her and harassing her friends. And it was starting to become clear what his motivations were. And then he got expelled finally because he threatened this Jewish student this girl I knew who was in a class with me, he threatened to stab her once. And the school then, it was a public school system, so but I think there's no way he could have stayed in, but they just kicked him out. And you made me think of this when you said that sort of nature, or Earth rather, humanity has a way of sort of, working this stuff out naturally, because he didn't get de-radicalized when he got expelled, obviously. It just made it worse. But his doubling down led to him going to Germany. And you know how well they handled neo-Nazis in Germany. And sure enough, he tried to pick a fight with someone who was getting pissed off at him for saying a bunch of neo-Nazi crap. And he got the crap kicked out of him, and he was deported. He was the one in trouble. I run into him a year later, and he's walking on the campus where I'm going to school.
Uh-huh.
And he just starts talking to me, and the first thing out of his mouth is, "I am so sorry what I was like trying to get you into when we were in high school together. Like I did not know what I was talking about." And he didn't seem like he was doing very well. He looked like he might've been homeless, but he was very self-aware about what he had been doing and saying and how awful it was. Yeah. So I think you're right that a lot of people will just end up, I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't like the idea of beliefs and especially thoughts being purged, if that makes sense, like from an exterior force. And I realize that, expressing yourself on the internet aren't your thoughts, but they essentially are, so trying to, because when you that's why people get so mad, I think, when they get censored on the internet, is because they feel like their thoughts are being purged from them without their say so. Even though that's completely insane to say, that's how it feels. So I think when you just try to purge that stuff from the outside, you're just going to reinforce it. So if you just let them operate in the real world, eventually something's probably going to, knock them down a few pegs. Now the problem is, what about the ones who don't get knocked down a few pegs?
Yeah.
It's the trade-off. You gotta figure, you can't have it both ways, is all I'm saying, I guess.
Yeah. I would like to think that those kind of people are fewer than what many would believe.
I mean, I think they are.
Whenever people talk about like the KKK,
are their membership numbers like a couple thousand or something like that?
Yeah. But somehow a video camera always seems to find them, and they always seem to be a lot bigger and a lot more scary than what they really are.
Yeah. Well, it's like and this is where the media kind of comes in, where like, I think we were being led to believe throughout 2017, 2018, that we were on the verge of this street battle civil war between Patriot Prayer and Antifa. And, I've met people who are in Antifa. They are a bunch of screw ups. They're not trying to start a street war. They're just doing something on the weekend. Okay. They are not organized. There's not millions of secret communists roaming the streets or anything like that. And just like there's not millions of secret white nationalists roaming the streets. This is mostly just people getting recreationally violent in the streets in these cases, I think, is what it is.
Yeah.
And and if anybody's ever, I guess the other thing that kind of bothers me too is this idea that it is a nationwide network, whatever you're talking about, like whether it's a white nationalist group or Antifa or whatever. A lot of these people travel. Like that's what, if you study protest movements, that's what a lot of that, I mean, the people who incited the Kent State protests that led to the horrible massacre of the students, to most of whom weren't even involved in the protest, mind you, like those people were traveling protesters. Mm-hmm. They went there, they whipped everybody up. And, if I'm being extra cynical, which I'm not really feeling cynical today, I'm having a good time right now, for example, but if I'm feeling extra cynical, I'm thinking they knew that the governor of Ohio would have overreacted, and they wanted to make martyrs out of the people in the movement because it would just further legitimize them. But there's no way I could know that. No way they could even have known that, probably. So, I bring up Kent State just because I see that as, I always sort of pinpoint that as the most shameful thing that's happened in living memory, one of the most shameful things, I should say, of American history. So, and I think that sort of should be seen as like the exact opposite of what that's like the last thing we want to happen.
Right.
Like we don't want any unrest to get to that point where the National Guard is shooting fellow Americans.
Right. Right. So, I mean, I don't know. Maybe a good way to summarize it is nothing is ever as good as you think it was, and nothing is ever as bad as what it seems.
That is I'm using that. I'm actually going to make that a quote, I think. I might make that a pinned quote on Twitter or something.
Yeah, my grandpa, he told me one time, he grew up during the Depression, fought in the Korean.
Oh, yeah.
And he said to me one time, he said, people talk about the good old days. He said, I don't remember any good old days. He said, I remember people stealing chickens out of our barnyard at night, and people, fighting, and, nobody had jobs. He said, I don't know about the good old days.
Yeah. And that's not, and the thing I always say, we were talking about this, like how things are better than they've ever been. When I think that a big mistake that I think some people have, and I call these people chronically anxious, frankly, because I totally know where they're coming from. It can be very scary. When you say things are better than they've ever been, you're not saying they can't get worse than they were before. I just think that it's a good way to, we were talking about this, you got to keep perspective when you look at the present. And that is what I do think history is capable of doing. It's worked for me. And I mean, to bring up my first episode, reading about the first Great Depression of 1873, we are so far and away better off than they were. People were starving to death in the streets. Yeah. People were murdering their own children. It was a nightmare. And the idea that like somehow we live in this hellscape, even during a pandemic, just seems insane to me when I look at that. But I do have to remind myself not to be too judgmental, because, it is scary. But I think that if we look at history a lot more, we can be at least less scared and then handle the stuff that does scare us a lot better.
Right. Yeah. I don't ever want to downplay human tragedy and what people are going through. But yeah, if you study history, it at least gives you a little bit of perspective.
Yeah. Dude, I think that's a good place to end on.
I was getting ready to say the same thing.
And we got a good amount of time on this. Yeah. Do you have anything you want to say before we close out?
No, not that I can think of. Just keep up the good work. I really
thanks, man.
Enjoy what you're doing. Learn a lot. You definitely
same to you.
Some things that I would not know otherwise.
It's and 2020 is looking good. I mean, I'm having my first full series coming out later this year that is going back to World War II. You'll be glad to know. So, not for the first 5 episodes, but still, it goes back to World War II, which, that's going to be a lot of fun. People should definitely look for your work over on, it's History Underground is the name of the channel, right?
Yes.
History Underground. And, if you want to find my stuff, go to historyimpossible.com. It's the best place to find it.
All right.
Thanks a lot, man.